r/Nosleep. Posted by Reddit user RichardSaxon. If the sky goes dark in the middle of the day, hide. Part 3. As children, we were told that the darkness wasn't something to fear. Our parents gave us empty promises that there were no monsters hiding in the shadows. They said whatever creaks and whatever cracks we heard were figments of our imagination. Yet we felt the horrors hiding beyond the edge of our vision, the threat looming right in front of us, obscured beyond recognition. We were right to fear the dark. After arriving at Tenebris, my childhood fear of the dark was revived. I quickly realized that it was perhaps one of the most logical instincts of humanity, one we were even born with, developed to keep us alive since the dawn of humanity, thousands of years ago. Sheriff Riley had just announced the plan to destroy the darkness, a ludicrous suggestion to any sane person, yet it remained our only chance at survival. How the hell are we supposed to do that? I asked. We've got explosives available. If the pillar really exists, that's our best bet. And how are we supposed to find it? I kept asking. Before Riley got the chance to answer my question, another light shattered, causing broken glass to rain down on the ground. It plunged another section of the building into darkness, allowing the shadow creatures to sneak closer. As they came inside, I could see the rotting organs piled up within it, a poor reconstruction of what had once been a human being. It grabbed one of the survivors, quickly merging with its flesh. He winced in agony, unable to scream as his lungs turned to mush. "Get him to the light," Riley yelled. George and I had rushed to grab him, pulling away from the ever-growing darkness. Alas, it was too late, and within just a few seconds, his insides had hollowed, and he'd become one with the shadows. "It's too late. He's gone," George sighed. "Sheriff, we gotta go, now." Though there were 3 patrol cars outside, we only had enough portable lights to secure one. Of the dozen or so survivors, only 4 would venture out on the suicidal mission: Riley, George, John, and myself. John was one of the few surviving cops, and among the youngest inhabitants of Tenebris. He volunteered without hesitation. "All right, we're dividing the lights into 2. Have to keep the building lit up, and the rest for the car," Riley ordered as we guided our survivors to the autopsy room. Without windows and with a heavy door, it remained the safest place for those who stayed behind. The 4 of us got ready, placing ourselves in front of the exit. Stepping out would most likely lead to certain death, but we had no other option. "You'll have a better chance staying behind. This is your last chance to back out," George said. He was an odd fellow. With every inhabitant of Tenebris stuck in town, physically incapable of leaving, he'd driven out to pick me up. Why could he break the rule of the dark remained a mystery. John looked at me. A look of horror struck his face. Though he was super eager to help, he lacked the experience the rest of us had. "Let's just go," he said nervously. With that, Riley unlocked the door, and we walked in formation through the dark, each holding onto a powerful searchlight. It kept the shadows at bay, allowing us to mount each light to the car. Within a couple of minutes, we were driving away from the station on a road of sacrifice. I let out an audible sigh of relief, as a false sense of security washed over me. The car had been secured by lights, creating a perimeter of lights around us, but it wouldn't last long. "How far is it?" I asked. "It's an hour's drive on a good day," said George. "But this isn't a good day." George drove the car slowly. With the limited line of sight ahead of us, it was a dangerous trek to travel. At the edges of our perimeter, shadow creatures loomed. They observed us from a distance, somehow absorbing the light, straining our laps in the process. "John, focus the beams on the monsters. Wherever they are, just keep them away," Riley said. He stuck his head out the window and pointed the searchlights toward the cluster of shadow creatures. They screeched as the lights burned them, chasing them away, if only temporary. "George, you need to tell us everything you know about the Pillar of Darkness," I ordered. He sighed, mulling over how to answer my loaded question. Back when my old man was the sheriff, when the darkness first introduced itself, he led a search and rescue operation into the heart of tenebrous woods. A kid had gone missing, which wasn't anything we'd experienced before in our small, peaceful town. He trailed off as the road narrowed. We drove over a rock sticking up from the ground, causing one of the lights to shatter. John quickly responded by shifting the rest. "Fuck! If we lose another light, we're screwed," John said in a panic. George slowed down even further, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. A day into the search, my father radioed in. He claimed he found something in the woods, some sort of dark structure. With his limited vocabulary, he described it as a pitch-black pillar that swallowed the light in front of him. Despite orders to wait for backup, he approached the damn thing, and that was the last thing we ever heard before he went silent. They were the first victims of the darkness. Tenebrous woods spanned a massive area. With the limited information we had, it would take us weeks to cover the entire grid. Anyway, they sent out a second search party to look for my dad and the missing officers. When those went missing as well, they sent out a third. As you might have guessed by now, after the third party went missing, they never sent a fourth. I could tell by Riley's unimpressed demeanor that it was a story he had heard before. "That's not exactly proof that the pillar exists. It could have been anything," Riley said. "Well, that's because you hadn't heard the whole story. There's a part I never told anybody," George shot back. "What?" "That I've seen it," he said somberly. That single sentence shut us all up, plunging the car in deafening silence. "You've seen it? The pillar?" Riley asked. "It was back when I first joined the police force, before I was reduced to driving people around. I had grown up without knowing what happened to my old man. After repeated refusals to open the investigation, I decided to take things into my own hands. So I set off in the depths of tenebrous woods, spending the first day just trying to get to the so-called forbidden zone. No sooner had I crossed the border, before the air changed around me. It had been cloudy, sure, but in the span of just a few seconds, the sky went dark. He took a break, as if he felt ashamed. I was young, afraid, lacking the guts to continue. I decided to turn back, only, no matter what direction I headed in, the sky kept getting darker. Within an hour, I was hopelessly lost and getting desperate. Though I don't know exactly where I was heading, I could feel the presence of the pillar. It needed sustenance, and that was it, just like my father before me. We hit another bump in the road, shattering another light. Then, I saw it, a towering structure wrapped in dark tendrils. It stretched into the far sky above, eating any light that dared touch its realm. I couldn't deny the fact that the pillar was alive, and it needed to be fed. At that time, I still hadn't seen any shadow creatures, but maybe they didn't even exist yet. All I remember is the darkness enveloping around me before I passed out. George brought the car to a screeching halt. The air felt dense, and the powerful lights we had mounted on the car just didn't reach far anymore. "We're here," George said. A surge of dread washed over me. We exited the car, surprised not to be overrun by the shadows. They simply observed us from a distance, keeping away from our lights, even though we had lost half of them. Our voices didn't carry very far either. Every sound felt muted around us, as if we were speaking underwater. "George, how did you escape last time?" John asked. He didn't respond, just shook his head. We dismounted the lights and brought them with us. George carried explosives, being the only one with enough experience to ensure a safe detonation. Hours passed as we ventured deeper into tenebrous woods. It didn't take long before the last of the searchlights finally died, leaving us with pathetically weak flashlights. I looked around, flashing my light at the occasional shadow that reached out from the dark. Standing by George's side, I felt oddly confident, as if the darkness couldn't touch us. I couldn't say the same for John and Riley, who were repeatedly assaulted by the monsters. Leaving George behind, I rushed over to help them when one of the shadows reached out for me and I fell to the ground. Riley pulled me back up as another shadow reached out for us. The hint of security I'd felt only moments ago vanished. Then I saw George, still walking confidently through the darkness, not a single shadow daring to touch him. "George, the shadows," I said in awe. "You all right?" he asked as I got to my feet. "The shadows, they're not... I stuttered in confusion. It was odd, as if a sense of brightness surrounded him. Wherever George stood, the darkness retracted, and he didn't even seem to notice. "What?" he asked, still oblivious. "We gotta keep moving," Riley interrupted. "Just stick together, alright?" They couldn't see it, despite the blaring hole in the darkness. They weren't aware. George was the only person to ever face the heart of the darkness and live, and it somehow kept us safe. We kept walking in silence. For each step we took, the forest grew thicker, dead branches hindering our progress. Despite the dense vegetation, there were no signs of life. Even the trees had long since perished, with their dried-out corpses. That was all left behind. "We're getting closer," George said. "How do you know?" Riley asked. "I don't know, I just... do." There was no point in arguing. Even with George's weird connection to the pillar, we had no other option but to blindly follow. John walked a bit ahead. He was young compared to Riley and George, and in far better shape. "John, slow down, will you?" I asked. "You don't even know the way." Without acknowledging us, he kept walking. "John!" Riley shouted. No response. Riley ran ahead to grab him. As he put his hand on his shoulder, a loud crack could be heard, and his arm popped off at his joint. John fell to the ground without uttering a single word. His abdomen was sunken in. His eyes seemed empty. He was dead. Without anyone noticing, a shadow had gotten inside and consumed his guts, all because he stepped a few feet ahead too far. "How the hell did that happen?" Riley asked in shock. I don't know. He just kept walking," George responded. Then John spoke. "I have to keep going. I have to keep going. I have to. It needs us. It needs to feed," he kept iterating, quieter each time. His chest sunk in as his lungs were eaten, and he quickly lost the ability to speak, yet his mouth kept moving, a hopelessly futile attempt at talking. "Sheriff, we have to keep moving," I said. We left John's body behind. No words spoken. We had accepted our deaths the moment we agreed to the mission, but if we could save the town, it would be worth the risk. The shadows followed us from a distance as we proceeded into the darkness. Our lights were dying, and our hopes wore thin. Hours had passed, if not days, as we wandered blindly towards the heart of the darkness, awaiting our much-anticipated deaths. Then I noticed the light from my flashlight bending in the wrong direction, as if it was something sucked away, further plunging us into more shadows. I turned round, noticing a thick, dark tendril stretching out towards the ground, leading a massive, bulging structure. It was the pillar. It was magnificently horrific, stretching endlessly far up into the sky. Rotting flesh covered its surroundings, and any light getting too close immediately faded into the vent of black surface. It twitched in response to our presence, and the shadows were quick to surround us as we got closer. "Wow, I can't believe it," Riley said in shock. "Yeah, but don't stop to admire it. Keep the perimeter clear while I fix the explosives," George said. Riley and I kept the area safe as we could, while George went to work. With the pillar eating up light, we could only clear a few feet ahead of us. By then, most of the dark shadows were flesh-bound. Within their dark frames, they carried the remnants of the townsfolk. "Oh God," Riley exclaimed. There, on the edge of the darkness, stood the emancipated remains of John, his body broken, carried by the shadow that occupied his empty husk. "John? Help me," he groaned back, his voice twisted by the shadow, speaking without air. Alongside the cry for help, he lifted his service weapon and fired. He was too quick for us to react, but even then he didn't aim for me, nor Riley, but for the one person the shadows could never touch. George let out a quick grunt as a bullet tore through his throat. Riley kept his flashlight fixated on the mutilated remains of John, causing him to drop the gun. I rushed to help George. His carotid artery had been severed, and his trachea torn to shreds. He lay there, bleeding into his own lungs, unable to speak. All he could do was stare at me as he coughed up chunks of half-coagulated blood. Despite the agony, he seemed at peace, as if dying was the preferable choice over living a life in Tenebris. "What's going on?" Riley asked, still keeping his light pointed at the shadows. Then, without a single word, George died in my arms. He'd spent the last 50 years living in the dark, and now, he'd never see the light again. He's gone," I said. The light in his eyes had vanished, and with it, the power that kept the shadows at bay. Without hesitation, they approached us, ready to add our flesh to the growing pillar. Riley rushed back towards the explosives, knowing that we couldn't get a safe distance in time. He grabbed me and pushed me out of the way. "Run!" I fled away from the pillar, which focused their attention on Riley. We gave each other one final glimpse, and I saw the undeniable feeling of guilt in his eyes. Regret that he had brought me into Tenebris, and regret that he hadn't tried to destroy the darkness before. This was his last chance. The ground shook under my feet. The tendrils had awoken, trying to grab onto me while I stumbled away from the pillar. Behind me, I could hear Riley scream in agony, and the shadows already reached him, and they were digging in through his guts. Then, an impossibly bright light filled the air. Riley had pulled the trigger, and the explosives shattered the pillar behind me. Despite being at a safe distance, the sound and shock waves sent me plummeting to the ground. A wailing sound of pain followed the loud explosion, as the darkness retracted back towards the pillar, giving way to the light in its wake. Once I recovered from the initial shock, I stared up at a clear, blue sky. I got to my shaking feet and returned to the site of the detonation. Riley and George had evaporated alongside the remains of the pillar. It was over. The trek back to town was monotonous. Still in shock, I wandered on autopilot, not sure what I would find once I got there. Tenebris was a beautiful place, a fact that had been obscured by the dark for so many years. I linked up with the last survivors, all of them speechless. Together, we mourned the loss of those who perished, gone but never forgotten. They could finally leave Tenebris and find new opportunities. To my surprise, most of them chose to stay behind. For better or for worse, the town had been their home, and they had nothing on the outside. At least it had been given a second chance, and could once again flourish as it had so many years ago. I returned back to my own city a few days later, with no clue how to report what I'd seen. I'm sure they'll come up with something more believable than the tale I have. Not that it matters what the public thinks, but to honor Riley, George, and all those who died, I wanted to share the truth about Tenebris. They didn't die for nothing.